I want to start our conversation today by saying this is the last of our 3 classes on African American poetry of the spirit. It is also the last of our adult ed sessions for this program year. So before we do this program, I want to say on behalf of, I suspect, everybody on the call, a thank you to Jennifer, to Jim Palmer, to all the people who have been part of the adult ed committee putting together all the programs and dealing with the challenges of what it means to do education during this pandemic year and producing things that have kept us both connected and educated. So thank you to all of you for what I think has been a really good year of adult education. I also want to do a thank you to Jennifer and Elise. When I suggested the idea of a class on African American poetry at some point last year, I had absolutely no idea where it would go or whether it would go at all. It grew out of my participation in some of the work of the Dismantling Racism team, because it seemed to me that in addition to all of the hard and difficult work that has to be done to make this a better country, a better community, the dismantling of the horrors that have existed, it is also important that we honor and recognize the beauty that has come in the midst of all of that. And in that, poetry and music are the pieces that I think of immediately. And so it seemed to me that as a piece of thinking about all the things we have yet to do, it's important to acknowledge the beauty of the history that has been handed down to us, and to do it in a way that says something about the common humanity that animates people who speak through words and music. And I said last week, Edward Hirsch ends his opening to his book on how to read a poem by saying these poems have come a long way to find you. And the beauty that has found me in Elise's music and Jennifer's selection of poems has made this both a wonderful 3 weeks and a wonderful time of preparation and developing this class. So since I get to start, I get to say thank you to you all. Jennifer will be working with it later in the show program, but if you have not looked at the Washington Post Arts and Style section this week, the lead article is on Kevin Young, who is the new director of the Smithsonian Museum of African American Culture. And he is a poet. He is actually the editor of the anthology that I've been using to find poems that speak to me. And he has a number of things to say that are important about the connection between poetry and the culture as a whole. But I want to start today by reading from a prose poem. It's the title poem of Margaret Walker's For My People, a book that was awarded, that made her the first Black woman to receive a national prize in literature. And that was in 1942. So this is her vision of both the past and the future of her people. For my people everywhere, singing their slave songs repeatedly, their dirges and their ditties and their blues and jubilees, praying their prayers nightly to an unknown God, bending their knees humbly to an unseen power. For my people, lending their strength to the years, to the gone years, and the now years, and the maybe years, washing, ironing, cooking, scrubbing, sewing, mending, hoeing, plowing, digging, planting, pruning, patching, dragging along, never gaining, never reaping, never knowing, and never understanding. For my playmates in the clay and dust and sand of Alabama backyards, playing baptizing and preaching and doctor and jail and soldier and school and mama and cooking and playhouse and concert and store and hair. For the cramped, bewildered years we went to school to learn to know the reasons why and the answers to and the people who and the places where and the days when. In memory of the bitter hours when we discovered we were Black and poor and small and different, and nobody cared, and nobody wondered, and nobody understood. For the boys and girls who grew in spite of these things to be man and woman, to laugh and dance and sing and play and drink their wine and religion and success, to marry their playmates and bear children and then die of consumption and anemia and lynching. For my people walking blindly, spreading joy, losing time, being lazy, sleeping when hungry, shouting when burdened, drinking when hopeless, tied and shackled and tangled among ourselves. For my people standing, staring, trying to fashion a better way from confusion, from hypocrisy and misunderstanding, trying to fashion a world that will hold all the people, all the faces, all the Adams and Eves and their countless generations. Let a new earth rise. Let another world be born. Elise?
Good morning, everyone. The piece that I'm going to end this series is He's Got the Whole World in His Hands. And ironically, is the same piece that I sung last week for service. But this is actually the same arrangement by the same composer, Margaret Bonds. I chose this because I think the title speaks for itself, knowing that we are Christians and we have to unite and practice what we preach. God is always watching us no matter what is going on. We just have to deliver his work. And to touch on Margaret Bonds, because today is a Margaret Day, she developed a close relationship with a well-known poet during the Harlem Renaissance, Langston Hughes. And so a lot of her music, particularly vocal and piano works, were set to his poems. And this piece in particular was actually composed and arranged in 1963, specifically and famously asked by diva and probably one of the most significant figures in Black history, let alone Black opera, Leontyne Price. So even though I am not going to obviously sound like Leontyne Price, I do know that this piece definitely holds a special place in my heart and a special place in music and Black history altogether. So I chose He's Got the Whole World in His Hands, arranged by Margaret Bonds. He's got the whole world in his hands. 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 He's got the woods and the waters in his hands. He's got the woods and the waters in his hands. He's got the sun or the moon right in his hands. He's got the whole world in his hands. got the birds and the bees right in his hand. He's got the birds and the bees right in his hand. He's got the beasts of the field right in his hand. He's got the whole world in his hand. He's got you and me right in his hand. He's got you and me right in his hand. He's got everybody in his hand. He's got the world in his hand. He's got the
That was beautiful, inspiring, awe-filled. I don't have enough words. That was lovely, lovely. Thank you to you. Thank you to Margaret Bonds. Thank you to Leontine Price. Thank you to the unnamed singers and writers who first sang that song and passed it down to their families and to their cousins and to their friends until somebody thought, let's write this down, and we all get to enjoy it. But that was beautiful. Thank you for sharing us. Music's an amazing thing. The circle, when you think about the circle of voices, the people who sang that song, and I think that's something that Linda's been talking about remember where these words came from, who sang them, who said them, where they lived and how they lived. I think Linda also said last week, talking about when we hear these songs again, I hope, as Linda does, as I know Elise does also, that those people and those stories and that place that those words come from are something that resonate with us a little bit more. All right, I'm going to go to the song. Actually, I'm going to share my screen with everybody. He's got the whole world in his hands. And I know these words are familiar to all of us, but I wanted to just put them in front of us for a minute to think about, to see them, right? They're so seemingly simple, right? The line, he's got the whole world in his hands, repeats throughout. And the idea of that image, right, is in some ways become so pervasive, the idea that we are held in God's hands. And in fact, the whole world is. It reminds me immediately, well, it reminds me of many things, but just last week, we were reading that song by the poem by Rita Dove, where, and sorry, I'm going to make us dizzy again. I'm going to scroll back up to that poem we read. See all the poems we've read here. To Straw Hat by Rita Dove. The idea of being held in God's hands. Here in the second stanza, Rita Dove said, when she talks about her grandfather traveling as a young boy as part of the Great Migration out of the South northward that many African Americans made, and which was the case for Rita Dove's grandfather, who made his way to Ohio. She talked about his journey, and her grandfather's a young man. And here in the second stanza, she wrote, he used to sleep like a glass of water held up in the hand of a very young girl. And I find those lines so beautiful. When I talk, it's funny, when I talk to my students, I teach this poem to middle schoolers, among other people, and I'm always fascinated. They go there immediately, that couplet, because it's so mysterious and so beautiful. But I think it's just like that song that Elise just sang for us, this image. And I read this, right, that held up in the hand of a very young girl, God figured as innocence, right? This cradling hand, and her grandfather as a young boy, who she compares to a glass of water, this image of purity. And then the whole extended metaphor of his sleep being like a glass of water held up in the hand of a very young girl, that idea of being cradled in that kind of protective state, in that state of innocence. So I love how these words resonate. And so listening to that song, he's got the whole world in his hands. There's so many echoes, as there always are with all works of art. But here's one we just read, right, 2 weeks ago. And we're talking about those lines in a different way, or that idea from a different artist in a different way, by Rita Dove, former US Poet Laureate, and now, I guess for many years, on the faculty at UVA. And here's the other thing I wanted to draw our attention to in that song. So there's that image of being held in God's hands, but I love how these words double down on who the whole world is, right? Because that's what changes. And as we all know from any work of art and music, poetry, the repetition sets up an expectation. And whenever that expectation is varied, we hear it, right? That stands out. And so what varies is the clarification of what's meant by the whole world. Who is the whole world? And we get, he's got the little bitty baby in his hands. And then the words go on to say later here, he's got you and me, brother, in his hands. He's got you and me, sister, in his hands. And then finally, he's got everybody here in his hands. And then back to the refrain and the title of the song, he's got the whole world in his hands. So I think words spoken from a marginalized people to remind us who everybody is so important. Who is everybody, right? Everybody. Who's the whole world? So that's what I hear when I listen to that song. It's deceptively simple, but those are often the most powerful things. I don't know if anybody else wants to jump in and talk about their associations with this song, because I know it's something that we've all heard, throughout our lives.
Jennifer, I don't know if Elise wants to comment on this, but some of the lyrics that she included about creation, the sun and the wind and the water, are not ones that I grew up hearing. But when you made the point about the whole world, it really does say that this poem means the whole world. And for me, I always just kind of focused on the rhythmic nature of the repetition and never really thought about how far it stretched.
Thanks, Linda. I agree, and you're right. This version doesn't have those lines. It's as we said, this was a song that existed, passed down from person to person, and so you'll find different versions of the lyrics. Anybody else have thoughts they wanted to share about this song? Because I know everybody's got associations.
The cute thing to do with this particular song is so wonderful to use with children, because you just ask them to offer up what the world is to them. And if you have young children, the best thing is, well, what motion goes with that word? And you can get a pretty rousing group going.
Hello?
Hello.
This song comports with one of the basic verses of the gospel, John 3:16.
Oh, we lost you, you're on mute.
This song I associate with the verse John 3:16. There are two operative words in it. For God so loved the world, and then that he gave his only begotten son. And the second operative word in that verse is whosoever. That verse is when I read it several months ago, it is all inclusive of who God loves. He loves the whole world, and whosoever believes in him. It's very inclusive. And this song reminds me of that verse.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, everyone. And I thank you for reminding us, again, one word touches another word. In fact, having you said that, I'm going to jump sort of a little out of sequence, but to that newspaper article that Linda referenced about Kevin Young. So I'm not going to unfold the picture other than to say, if you get the post, you should read the Arts and Style section, which introduces us to the new director of the Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture. But Kevin Young is a poet first. And he still is the poetry editor of the New Yorker magazine. So it might seem to be an unusual choice for a director of a museum, though he also wore that hat in New York City as a director of another African American cultural center associated with the New York Public Library. But this is what Young said about connections, just about the kind of connections everybody's making, and about the job of poetry. He wrote, and this is from the article, the poet's job is to make connections. Poets say, this thing is like that other thing. And in fact, they say, this thing is this other thing, making a metaphor. As a museum director, I'm really interested in making meaning and helping people to make those connections through what they see and what they experience. So that's what we're doing today. And that's what we do all the time, is making those connections. Those words in that song, for Jeff, reminded him of that verse from the Bible. For Nancy, she remembered her connection with, teaching children that song, which, I remember, I'm sure probably we all remember learning this song as children. So that richness is, it's what makes meaning, right? All right. I'm sorry, I don't want to cut anybody else off. Does somebody else want to say anything about this beautiful song?
I guess I'll jump in since I sung it. I think the first time I heard this piece or the spiritual was when I was younger. And I think someone mentioned that it's a good piece for children because, we're innocent, we're young. And so we are trying to start a foundation of loving and caring, and also display from our parents, adults, guardians. And then as I grew with the piece in my vocal studies, I got to hear and sing different arrangements of it, different text, slightly different text, I should say, but to know that at the end of the day, it's one theme. God so loved the world, and he does have the whole world in his hands.
Thank you. Elise, I love what you said about what you felt about it or believed about it when you were a child, what you learned and understood about it as a young music student, and what it came to mean to you as an adult, as a professional singer, and just all those layers, which, maybe I'm stating the obvious, but meaning isn't static. Anyway, thanks. All right. Well, I think I'm going to jump backwards a little bit just to remind us to connect to the poem Linda read. So here, just to remind us, right, of this poem. So I'm going all the way to the top just so we can see Margaret Walker's name. Our two Margarets today, as I think Linda referenced. I love that we've got these two Margarets, these two powerful, beautiful African-American women born within 2 years of one another. Interestingly, Margaret Bonds was born in 1913. Margaret Walker was born in 1915. And for both of them, and I want to draw this connection as well, Langston Hughes played an enormous role in their lives as a collaborator in the case of Margaret Bonds, ultimately, and for Margaret Walker as a mentor and inspiration for Margaret Walker when she, and both women went to Northwestern University. They overlap in so many different ways. But when Margaret Walker was a young student at Northwestern, she really felt alienated and out of place and marginalized and Langston Hughes' poem, The Negro Speaks of Rivers, was something she discovered in the public library of the basement of the public library in Evanston. And it became a touchstone for her. And so later on, when she met Hughes, went to a reading that he gave and with her poems clutched in her hand. And he said, keep writing. And when, the fact that 10 years later, she published For My People, won the Yale Younger Poets Prize, which is giant prize, is just such an exciting story. But these words, sorry, I got sidetracked by Margaret Walker herself. But I love, again, here's repetition. We talk about poetry and music and the similar tools they use. The line "for my people" repeats in various versions, or "for my," in a very incantatory way throughout this poem. And it's mesmerizing. And she goes through the litany of work, memories of childhood, of adulthood, of working and marrying and having children and dying, the joyful and the deeply painful. And she gets to the end of this poem, and I'm sorry we can't spend more time on all of it, but I want to draw our attention to the last couple of stanzas. Oops, I'm going to read them again. For my people standing, staring, trying to fashion a better way from confusion, from hypocrisy and misunderstanding, trying to fashion a world that will hold all the people, all the faces, all the Adams and Eves in their countless generations. Let a new earth rise. Let another world be born. Let a bloody peace be written in the sky. Let a second generation full of courage issue forth. Let a people loving freedom come to growth. Let a beauty full of healing and a strength of final clenching be the pulsing in our spirits and in our blood. Let the martial songs be written. Let the dirges disappear. Let a race of men now rise and take control. I love this reimagined earth, this reimagined world. So for my people, let a new earth rise, this new world. Let another world be born. I couldn't help but hear the song that Elise sang echoing here, this idea of a new world and who's in this world. Again, here back to that second to last stanza, that will hold all the people, all the faces, all the Adams and Eves and their countless generations. They're saying the same thing, seems to me, in different ways, but the same thing. Let a new earth rise. Let another world be born. So for me, again, echoes. And I don't know if anybody else wanted to jump in and talk about things that occurred to them with these words. I realize they're maybe new, but if anybody wants to jump in, please do.
I wanted to say, this is Carolyn, echoing back to the second verse where she says, the gone years and the now years and the maybe years.
Yeah.
And then at the end, she's describing the maybe years, that through all that working, I was very moved by this, through all that working and reaping and just that there's a dream still.
Yeah. Yeah. Through all of that.
Through all of it. And then her description of it at the end.
Yeah. From confusion, from hypocrisy and misunderstanding. Thanks, Carolyn. Yeah, I love how this poem builds, that repetition, the pressure of that repetition.
I also think as you read it, that last verse especially, that has this been put to music? I mean, there's really a song in that those last stanzas there, that last stanza of a new earth rise, let another world be born. I could just hear that being put to music. by somebody. I wonder if it has been, but somebody should. It would make a good one.
Yeah, it would. And I don't know, Elise, do you know if it's been set to music?
I don't think so. I would probably have to ask some of my colleagues via Facebook and other social media, because I know that with everything that happened last year, I know some of my colleagues have composed or in the process and still are composing works that deal with Black struggle as well as Black pride and the Black family. But I am not familiar with this in a musical setting, should I say?
Thanks.
Maybe you and Stephen could work on that.
That would be something. Yeah. Well, so for me, those two pieces speak to each other. We keep on saying how they speak to us, how they speak to each other. So I'm going to move now because I realize time is precious. So unless somebody has a few more words, which I welcome, about either of these, I'm going to move us forward. I want to spend a brief moment with this very well-known poem. Just because I want Langston Hughes's voice to be part of the conversation, because as I said, he was so important to the Harlem Renaissance, to American poetry in general, to African American poetry in particular. And for both women, he was in one case a collaborator, in one case a mentor and a source of inspiration. And he wrote this, perhaps almost, maybe this is his best known poem, I don't know, but he wrote it when he was 17 years old, which always surprises me to be reminded of that. And he wrote it when he was on a train heading to see his father. And when he crossed the Mississippi River, he pulled out an envelope and wrote this poem on the back of it. It was, and later published. So he wrote it in 1919. And then it was published later in 1921 when Du Bois published it in Crisis magazine. So I want to read this poem so we have it in our ears. All right. I've known rivers. I've known rivers ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood and human veins. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. I bathed in the Euphrates when dawns were young. I built my hut near the Congo and it lulled me to sleep. I looked upon the Nile and raised the pyramids above it. I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, and I've seen its muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset. I've known rivers, ancient, dusky rivers. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. It's a beautiful thing, this poem. And for me, the way it resonates with some of the other things we've already listened to is this image of the soul of this person. And I love how the soul of this people, the soul, and then I love how this poem shimmers, who the I is, shimmers. There's the individual voice of the 17-year-old boy who wrote this. There's the people he's speaking from, imagining, and then there's the voice. God's voice threads through here too. Who is I in this poem? And I think all those three possibilities are there. I bathed in the Euphrates when dawns were young. Right, this sunrise creation image, and the way the water passes through history and passes through this people's history. And we get the return, the refrain, right? Again, a refrain, repetition. I've known rivers, ancient, dusky rivers. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. Contemporary poetry, and I'd put this in that bucket, uses music differently from some more traditional forms, which use things like end rhyme and a more regular metric line. but repetition is still repetition, and it takes many forms. And so here we see that use of refrain. I've known rivers, and then again, I've known rivers, and then qualified ancient dusky rivers. And then my soul has grown deep like the rivers. It's a different kind of musical device, but music it is. I don't know if anybody else wanted to say anything about this poem, because it's well known and well loved, and so there might be things folks want to share about it.
Just all the verbs: the known, bathed, built, looked, raised, heard, went down, known.
No. Thanks. Yeah. All right. I'm going to move us to another poem. This is our thread, and I like the idea of this river, right? This piece of the world. There's that image again. Threading through. And the influence of this person threading through these people's lives. So I'm going to change gears and take us to another poem by Tracy K Smith. And Tracy Smith, here she is again. We read one of her poems, or she read one of her poems to us both last time. And here again, another US poet laureate, Smith, born 70 years after Langston Hughes, right? That's exciting. You know, she was born in 1972. He was born in 1902, 60 years after the two Margarets, or 60, ish years after the two Margarets. So Tracy Smith, former US poet laureate, and now for many years on the faculty at Princeton. And she's written another beautiful poem that I want to share. And then I've got this wonderful video recording of her reading it, care of Bill Moyers, and read this poem called An Old Story. You can see the bolding I'll just leave alone. That was my conversation with myself. Anyway, here's Tracy Smith's poem, An Old Story. We were made to understand it would be terrible. Every small want, every niggling urge, every hate swollen to a kind of epic wind, livid the land and ravaged like a rageful dream, the worst in us having taken over and broken the rest utterly down. A long age passed, when at last we knew how little would survive us, how little we had mended or built that was not now lost. Something large and old awoke, and then our singing brought on a different manner of weather. Then animals, long believed gone, crept down from trees. We took new stock of one another. We wept to be reminded of such color. All right, now I'm going to go to a recording of Tracy Smith reading the same poem, which is always a treat.
I'm Tracy K Smith, and this is a poem called An Old Story, which I wrote in an attempt to create a new myth, one that might be useful to America in the 21st century, at a moment characterized by great social and political division. An old story. We were made to understand it would be terrible. Every small want, every niggling urge, every hate swollen to a kind of epic wind, livid the land and ravaged like a rageful dream. The worst in us having taken over and broken the rest utterly down. A long age passed, when at last we knew how little would survive us, how little we had mended or built that was not now lost. Something large and old awoke. And then our singing brought on a different manner of weather. Then animals, long believed gone, crept down from trees. We took new stock of one another. We wept to be reminded of such color. Thank you.
I'm going to take us back to the poem so we can see it in front of us. But I love this newly imagined, she calls it an old story, right? This poem is told in mythic time. I love her newly imagined world and creation. And she moves us there quite powerfully. Just to spend a few moments about what she's doing as a writer, you'll notice again on the formal elements she's using here. Typically poets will break a line, sometimes jam a line, which means breaking it in a way that's counter to the syntax of the sentence. So to create emphasis on that final word of the line, which is different from the final word of the sentence or the phrase. What Smith is doing is a little different from that, which is unusual. So again, she's making us pay more attention. We can see it here in the first line. We were made to understand it would be terrible. That terrible, the beginning of the next line, and she does it again here. A long age past. You could hear when she read it, right? She read it that way, pausing at that first line of the new word of the new line, which breaks this enjambed line, breaks against the syntax of the sentence. A long age, and she's stretched out, and look at all this white space. She stretches out this space, a long age past. And I'm going to take us back to that first line, which she does the same thing. And you can see is that my conversation I was having with myself, the first half of that opening line, we were made, right? That's in that line. We were made by God. We were made to understand, right? Another echo. It would be terrible. Every small want, every niggling urge, every hate swollen to a kind of epic wind. Right? This scale that she's writing on, this mythic scale she's writing on. And then here's her newly imagined, right? Here's the space, a long aged past. When at last we knew how little would survive us, how little we had mended or built that was not now lost. Something large and old awoke. I love the power of that line. And then our singing. We've been talking about singing a lot. Here's somebody else talking about singing, right? And this is from her book. As you notice, she was reading Wade in the Water, right? Titled for that song, right? And we read that poem. And then our singing brought on a different manner of weather. I love that image. The song, the voices, the singing brings on a different weather, creating a new weather out of our voices. Then animals, and here's her new creation, long believed gone, crept down from trees. We took new stock of one another. We wept to be reminded of such, and she pauses here, of such color. We wept, reminded of such color. Who's included in this new world she's imagining? Again, we're back to that hymn. Everybody is included. comments from anybody else? If people want to jump in, I know this is a new poem, so but I'd love to hear thoughts.
You know, I always go back to the Old Testament, and it reminds me of the world before and after the flood.
Yeah.
The what brought on the brokenness, and then the realization of what it means to start again, and the beauty that can be there when you start again.
Thanks. Yeah, there's a lot of Old Testament in this poem.
I think the whole idea of enslavement of people in whatever form enslavement takes place, whether it's the slaves of Black people or just slaves of living, of certain living, it's utterly broken down, everything broken down, and then a long time passed. But I see a cycle in this. I mean, I don't think we're there yet. But the beautiful picture of because fear has struck at people and kept them down. And then that whole idea of climbing down from the trees. It's just a beautiful image of being able to come out from hiding, from repression.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I see anyway.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to very quickly take us to our last poem because I realize we have a few minutes left, but I want to give us this last poem to close out. This is a prose poem by Ashley Jones. And I wanted to end with her because she's currently the guest editor of Poetry Magazine, which is probably the poetry magazine, certainly the oldest in this country. And she's the current guest editor. And I definitely urge you all to go to the Poetry Foundation website and look at some of her, what she's written there, and conversations she's had about writing from the perspective as a Christian woman, and owning that part of her identity. And this poem, I'm going to close us out here. I don't have a recording of her reading it, I'm sorry to say, but I'm going to give it a read. Friendly Skies, or Black Woman Speaks Herself into God. We're taxiing at an airport named after American President Ronald Reagan. People tell me he was an American hero. Sometimes labels are jumbled in the big dark bag we called Manifest Destiny. Sometimes things get lost in its velvet mouth. As we move across the land in a machine built for sky, we wait for the flight attendant to tell us how to be safe, how to will ourselves alive 30,000 feet in the air if we find ourselves falling to an inevitable end, how to build a raft from breath alone to face a gulping sea. Our attendant, Valerie, is Black. Her braids hang a holy rope in a high ponytail, her eyes divinely familiar. When the disembodied voice booms over the plane's speakers, we see her mouth moving in time with its words. To ensure your safety, she says, secure your mask before helping others. Her lips make the shape of our salvation. Reader, this might be how you felt sitting in the movie theater's strobe lit box when you saw Black Panther, when you realized a Black person could feel as big as God, could save the world and make it home in time for dinner, run a whole country against no white background, could know all the land and its secrets and roam at the afterworld, leisurely resting after a life of nothing colonized, after all the sweat of work done just for self, of work unstolen and unenslaved. And I know Valerie isn't God, but I also know that she is standing here, commanding this voice we thought was faceless, using her earthly body to show us the way. Here, with her hands, which will pour us fizzy drinks in our little plastic cups, usher trash from our laps into an unknown abyss. I know if this thing goes down in a fiery cocoon, she will part every sea to cradle us. She will speak to us through the fire. You are that you are. Well, I don't know how better to end this, but those powerful words from this woman in the air, this Black goddess, right? God figured as an airline stewardess speaking to us from the heavens. You will be safe, cradling us with her voice, speaking to us through the fire. You are that you are. He's got the whole world in his hands, or maybe I should say, she's got the whole world in her hands. Well, we are out of time. I wish there were more time, but there's more, but I want to recommend to all of you great sources. Linda mentioned this book here. Oops, I should stop sharing. The poem, as lovely as it is. Just so you can see, this book is a great resource. Kevin Young edited this anthology, African American Poetry, 250 Years of Struggle and Song is a great resource. Is that Ashley Jones is the guest editor of Poetry Magazine for the next 3 months. And the Poetry Foundation's website has great podcasts, a wonderful conversation with her and this Muslim poet Faisal Muhammad. And they just like bond. They have this great conversation about his poem, Allah Castles. Rita Dove's Thomas and Beulah, Tracy Smith, Life on Mars, and Wade in the Water. I don't have a copy of that with me. So I hope you all go to some of those resources. Thank you for being with us. It's been, for Elise and for Linda and for me, it's been such a wonderful conversation. We've really, I don't know, Linda, Elise, do you guys want to jump in and add anything to this has been so awesome?
You said it right there. It's been great. Learning experience for me to know about further poems and, the experience and how music and poetry is always related, and especially for African Americans and Blacks in this country, because I know people don't like to be called one or the other, so that's why I say both. It's definitely has a connection, but it ties back to history and everything from the good, the bad, and the ugly. So it's been great. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you both. It's been, as we said at the very beginning, the three of us talked and decided if we had a good time, you guys were invited along for the ride. So we hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have.